we are moving towards responsible AI implementation in practice. This speech will be delivered to us by Ashley Casovan, Executive Director at Responsible AI Institute. And Ashley is engaged and innovative leader who has always had a deep interest in advancing the public good. Recently, leaving her long-standing career in the public service, where she was last Director of Data and Digital for the Government of Canada, she has now taken on the role of Executive Director of Responsible AI Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to creating practical tools to ensure the responsible use of AI. Her work helps to inform government, industry, and academic research, and I'm super happy to have Ashley with me on the stage today. Hello, Ashley. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. Have you unmuted yourself?
Hi. Good morning. Sorry, it's early in Canada.
So, good morning. It's quite late afternoon already in Vilnius. So, we are great to have you here. In the recent presentation, we've heard what is responsible AI, how different countries are using it, and do we have a common ground globally when we speak about it? So, we hope to hear some practicalities in your presentation, aren't we?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm excited to talk about. And I know the last presentation was speaking about OECD. I happen to be a member of the OECD network of experts. And so really, this is all about how those different theoretical concepts and discussions that we're having at different government levels, but also within companies as well, academic institutions, all really come together.
Amazing. So the virtual floor of Vilnius is yours, and we are ready for your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. So I know already from the presentation before and the discussions today, I don't need to explain what the impact of AI will be. I do think that one of the things that's important to highlight is how we think about it and how people are interpreting it. And so again, in the last presentation, hearing how some of governments are really thinking about the lack of trust that exists, or some of the concerns like transparency, and really wanting to find explicit ways to deal with that. And so we see that all over, but really trying to understand what that is something that I've been really interested in. So just today, wanted to share with you, as you heard already, I'm in Canada, and I wanted to share a little bit about our journey there, and starting in about 2018, how we started thinking about this from a policy perspective, how that's brought me to the work that I'm doing now. And then how those efforts in terms of thinking about public governance are really being applied in a very practical way to building out a certification mark for the responsible use of AI systems. And so we've really been reflecting on, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of AI for, I've been with the Responsible AI Institute for 2 years now, and prior to that, 2.5, I guess. And prior to that, at the Government of Canada, where I had really led a lot of work related to the use of open source tools and technology, as well as the development of Canada's Open Government Portal. And so my background is really in data architecture, and I've been really interested in how data helps drive decision-making so that we can also provide a better insight into how we're making policies, but then also just how data can provide better services to the public. And in that capacity, as you can imagine, by 2018, we started hearing a lot and getting a lot of opportunities from different companies about the different types of AI that could come and really help build on those desires that we had. And so I took a move from just building out open government mechanisms for the purpose of being transparent and trying to provide data to the public, and really thought again about that broader holistic use and impact that data would have in these systems. And in fact, I'm recently seeing, because there's lots of questions around what the scope of AI actually is, AI being so many different things. And as I've articulated here, that really AI companies, all companies are becoming AI companies because they are at the heart of it, as I was just saying, driven by data. And so whether you think of this as data-powered products or AI systems, I think that, and I'm sure that you've heard today about all of these different applications, but I really, really like these two examples because I think for me, when I saw this, and it was just this past year, both of these examples, that I really realized how extensive the application of AI systems are, and why then we need to think very critically about how we're designing, developing, and deploying these systems. And so before I get into the inner workings of how at least we're working to adapt these efforts, I'll just share these with you in that the first one is around AI in mining. And a lot of what we are doing and thinking about, and I think, again, we heard in the last presentation, is the adoption of safety critical standards and rules around the use of these technologies. And in the circumstance of mining, it makes a lot of sense that that you would use sensors and in places where they could be dangerous to humans. And so it's a really interesting application, and probably just because it's not my world typically, I hadn't really thought about those opportunities. And then the other one was around heating and cooling systems. And so there's a company here in Montreal called Brainbox AI, and I was actually told about them by one of my American colleagues who was really talking about the changes in the HVAC community. Long story as to why I have been engaged in these conversations, all to say that there's a lot of, it's not typically what I'm involved with, but we get a lot of people that come to us to ask us about how their industry might shift or change as a result of AI systems and technology, how they can adapt, but also the need for it. And in this circumstance, I found it really, really fascinating because what he was telling me is that there's not enough people to actually be in part of or be participating that want to do jobs in heating and cooling industry. The technicians are just not available. And so at the rate that they need them. And so again, having monitors to be able to control the system, and this company in particular really, I think, aligns well with a lot of the objectives that we have from a climate perspective as well, because they're trying to ensure that there's the appropriate use of when a room should be hot or when a room should be cold based on people that are there. And these are like really incredible things that these sensors can do, and therefore learn and adapt to the behaviors of the building and the people in the building, also alert when things are wrong. So I just, again, maybe just because it's not typically what I've seen in the public service perspective, which is where, as you've heard, I've spent the majority of my career, or where we hear a lot of fears related to robots turning bad or chatbots becoming racist. Really, that was quite interesting to me to see how not only in manufacturing, but really day-to-day service delivery, the invisible things that we don't see, there's all of these different opportunities. And so in that, though, really the heart of where I started with AI was in the public service. And I think that it's quite important to at least, I guess, know where my drivers are coming from and why then thinking about these applications of a certification to ensure fairness, accuracy, accountability, et cetera, in these applications. And so one that was happening at the time when I was in the government of Canada was really looking at benefits modernization. And I know from my colleagues in governments all over the world, this is something that's happening quite a bit. And many countries provided support during COVID, which was something that became an opportunity to see whether benefits systems were working really well, or whether there were some challenges there. And many took some time to kind of get up to speed to the volume that they really needed to produce. And so it was interesting to see again how if utilizing a system that can help to augment what and how humans are providing those services, then people get access to resources that they need a lot quicker. And so we're really talking in many of these circumstances about the criticality of using technology to help to advance public service. In that also, I've talked a lot about sensors already this morning, but that was also something that Canadian Pacific Rail used in relation to ensuring that there was a limited amount of train derailments. There were some issues that had occurred in the past. And so basic things like knowing when to change the tires or the wheels on the train. And so monitors and monitoring can really help to ensure that. Then moving down to the chatbots, one really interesting example that will probably always stay with me is the pilot program that our tax or revenue agency provided information that was direct on the website. This actually isn't an example of AI, but I think that it's relevant to this discussion because they took just the static content, trained the chatbot with that information, or loaded it into a chatbot, really is what it more so was, because there was no machine learning component to it. But what happened was when people had questions about their taxes, which it's always makes a bit of a nervous season for everyone, they were able to ask questions and then not search on the website for that information. And those who were part of that pilot found it really, really useful. And then finally, as I mentioned, some of the more behind the scenes things are using this vast amount of data and then algorithms to be able to help to support improved decision making for policy purposes. And in this circumstance, there was a program for suicide prevention, which again, I'm sure all of our nations have. And they found that it was really helpful to not only help predict where there could be areas of concern, both regionally, but also where individuals, how those who call hotlines might be able to be better promoted and protected. And so literally the ability to save lives is something that the public sector takes quite seriously. And so if AI can help to do that, there's, again, a lot of opportunity for that. However, there was still a lot of concern. So there's all this promise, and yet there's also concern about how AI is actually going to be applied in some circumstances. I was even mentioning manufacturing earlier. Is it going to be taking over people's jobs? At what cadence? How will it train people that will it provide an opportunity for people that would typically be trained? Lawyers are a great example by reading lots of case data or lots of case information. And so that's something that led to, at least in the Canadian context, and I know this is not just here, a lot of concern around the acceptance of the use of these systems, especially in the public service, where, as I've mentioned on the previous slide, there's a lot of applications or services that really are supporting the livelihood of people. And so the one that, or why I like this particular outcome of this broader survey was to see that the more that it matters, the lower the support was. And so the greater their concerns were. And so it was a real challenge for us to try and figure out why that was happening, how we could really try and mitigate some of those concerns or fears. And we really had to then reflect on why this narrative was taking place. And a big reason for it was because there was a lot of news articles that were really contributing to that fear that were taking place at the same time. I won't go in order on this one, and I don't want to dwell too much on it because I'm sure lots of you have thought about a lot of these things. But one that's come up a lot in the news and continuing to recent is the use of targeting for different types of policing activities. And I know it's been a discussion around the use of police using body-worn cameras for identification, and challenges related to the accuracy of that are very, very concerning. But it doesn't, one of the challenges that I have is then applying the use of facial recognition systems and that lack of accuracy all across the board, because it can actually be used really well in certain types of applications. But that's not the nuance that's typically discussed in a lot of these articles. And so, but there are other things that I am very concerned about, like in the top corner, the use of biometrics. This is an example of biometrics in classrooms to be able to help autistic children. And it's great if it were accurate, and it's helping, of course, anything to do that. But the use of biometrics to detect people's sentiment hasn't proven to be overly accurate. And so the concern that we have is that broadly, that again, we're very much proponents of the use of AI, see the impact, but recognize that sometimes it does hurt people through this incorrect identification. As you saw on the other slide, a misdiagnosis of health can be a big concern that we have as well. And then, as I'm sure has been talked about a lot today, bias that can creep into these systems, and that can be for a variety of reasons. It can come from the data, it can come from how the algorithm or the model or models were developed. And so it's something that we really want to ensure is not jeopardizing people's lives or their livelihoods with things like access to credit, really providing stability in their families, which can lead to bigger and broader problems. And so within this, I've spoken about the fact lack of accuracy within these systems, which is why I mentioned sometimes it doesn't get us or see us, and that biometric challenge that I think we all still have. And then a lot of what's discussed is in this community is privacy. And so sometimes it's collecting information about us without that explicit consent. And yes, there's a lot of great work, especially in Europe, around general data protection to avoid this. The surveillance types of tools, we don't always know why they're using the different type of data or how it's connected or where we've provided permissions on our phone, particularly to other types of applications. I know myself, I'm just kind of always clicking like, yes, okay, because I just need that application for whatever reason, and not always taking the time to understand what it is that I'm consenting to. And so these are really broad concerns. We track them. This is just a small screen cap of a map that we have of various different use cases on our website. And so we try and track these to really understand the incidents and then the potential harms that they're causing, so that we can be quite explicit in the mitigation strategies that we're proposing. And so I know that you heard on the last panel about why we need responsible AI. I won't go through this very in a lot of detail, because you'll see on the other slides a lot of the ways that we're approaching combating some of these challenges of there being that low trust that I've talked about, of clear regulations that are specific not being in place. And also that there's a lot of goodwill and interest and intent, but there's not a clear and consistent way of integrating all of this research that's happening, which is quite interesting and quite critical. But also, as I mentioned, mapping the potential harms to then that desired outcome. And we've seen in the news just this week, at least in the US context, that there was Zillow, which was buying and selling houses, and they actually shut their entire this application that did that down. It was an AI system that was automatically buying and selling houses, I should have mentioned. And in one circumstance, I saw a tweet 2 weeks ago where this man had sold his house above market price, 25% above market price via Zillow. And then the next week he bought it back from them for well below market price. And so in this circumstance, a lot of critics have been saying, well, fortunately, it was the company that was impacted, not the people that were the buyers in this circumstance, which, yes, it's great. At the same time, a lot of people lost their jobs because this system was designed and continuing to be put into operation and then just very quickly shut down. And so people's lives are being impacted. Even though in this circumstance, it had the impact on the company. And so I think it's something important that we need to think about. And very quickly, one of my favorite examples is Robinhood, which is a trading app. And it's quite interesting because they were trying to, I think, really start with a positive intent of trying to democratize trading. And in that, they ended up using behavioral social nudging through the use of things like confetti when a trade was made. And it ended up resulting in very critical harm to people losing money and worse. And so the challenge with this came through the Federal Trade Commission and as well as the SEC in the US context. And in it, I've been tracking this story for the last year and a half, I guess. And recently they've had to change those behavioral gestures in their app. And so I think these are examples of how things can go wrong, but also what can happen to rectify or mitigate. So it's not just about, in the case of Zillow, shutting down everything, but really making some of these changes, some of these quick changes to be able to ensure that there isn't harm. And so in this, there's been a lot of interest from the international community, as you've heard, lots of academics, lots of researchers in figuring out how does one actually respond to this? How do you really understand those harms? And then what should we do about it? And so all of that was a lot of really incredible research that was taking place kind of 2016 to it's still ongoing, but a big bulk of principles came out kind of 2018, 2019 into 2020. And then I think 2021 was a year where people were like, okay, we've got to put these principles into practice. And in that, as was mentioned in the earlier presentation, the OECD has really become that place where people are and experts and then nations are gathering together to think about these implications, but also do so in that consistent way. And so these are the OECD principles, and you can see that they're quite high level in saying things like AI should benefit people and the planet. And as you can see from the examples that I use, that's not always the case that happens. Even things like respecting the rule of law, human rights, it's really difficult to figure out how to apply that. And then things like being transparent and responsible, robust, secure, safe, I mentioned a little bit. And then also developing or deploying or operating the system, doing so with proper functionings. But a lot of that became really difficult to figure out. These were being drafted when we were thinking about this first generation of AI policy in the Canadian context. And so these were the implementation requirements that we came up with to ensure that those broader principles were able to be put into practice. And so a lot of these things I've mentioned through my examples, things like testing, monitoring, contingency planning, so ensuring that ongoing operation. You heard about and have heard a lot about the need to explain these different types of requirements. But then things like peer review were something that were quite interesting because it was not really a concept that was part of a enterprise architecture review board or any other type of technology review process. So taking in a lot of these social science constructs and putting them with technology testing was something that was really quite important for us. And so in that, I did move away from the public sector or one particular government to expand, recognizing that what was really advantageous about what we had done was we opened that policy development, and we had experts from industry, academia, civil society providing input into the work that we were doing. And I then did a lot of research related to private sector governance and how that can support these public sector objectives, but be a lot more specific or contextualized. And so that's why, as you can see with all of these examples of the various different AI systems and how we were thinking about them and how I continue to think about them, one type of rule is not going to fit all of them. And so what we've done is we've really thought at the Responsible AI Institute about an application or implementation framework. And so from all of the work that we've done and mappings of all of these various different principles and policy documents, et cetera, we have come up with these 6 implementation concepts. So accountability, bias, fairness, consumer protection, robustness, security, and safety, explanation and interpretability, and systems operations. And that's really how we're defining responsible. Our application of that is to the system as a whole. So I've mentioned throughout these examples the inputs of data, those models and how those are trained, and then the context in which they're situated in. And so within that, we're really trying to make sure that we're being thoughtful about those different mitigation approaches and how to take those requirements to that. And so in this, you can see, and I'll stop here. In this, you can see that we're really trying to then take all of those use cases that I was talking about earlier, ones that we continue to work on, and create that feedback loop between what the OECD is doing and really providing, as well as then the framework, the implementation framework that we've created, and using the experience from the community to apply those lenses to this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That was very interesting. And I have a question for you. Looking at how responsible AI evolves, can you comment a little bit how it evolves in different sectors? For example, manufacturing, healthcare, finance. Do we have any industry in particular where we have developed it till the moment we are proud of?
I think that it's evolving with different degrees of maturity in different industries. I would say finance probably is the most mature. They've been using algorithm trading for a long time. And so they're continuing to build on that effort now. And so it's something that we see a lot of maturity there in both terms of the applications, but the regulations as well. Healthcare, somewhat similarly, but that's definitely an industry that's still starting to evolve.
And I was thinking, you have been of both sides. You've been on the governmental sector, now you are on non-profit, but still working with AI and digital. So if you had an opportunity to travel back in time, what are the best experiences you would take from now to then?
Well, I hope by being in this intersection of industry, civil society, and public sector, I have the best of all of those worlds right now. So that's why, as you can tell from the presentation, I'm really interested in public sector application of these tools, but recognizing that there's a vendor community that's typically companies are providing those to the government. And I think that's quite important.
And speaking of cooperation, during our conference today and yesterday, we've been speaking a lot about how Europe should unite and build things together to be stronger, to be more united, to achieve better things. So what about you? What are your counterparties? Are you partnering with the US, or you have other countries that you really rely on this journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that Europe is definitely a region that works really well together through especially on the regulatory side, which is what I follow the most. And in that capacity, Canada definitely always has a close relationship with the US. My organization is actually US based, so it gives me a particular advantage to do so. However, there's a lot of effort underway. There was a back-to-back joint chairmanship at the G7 between Canada and France. And this was in 2018, and that evolved into what is now the Global Partnership on AI. And part of what the effort of GPAY is to do that co-development and think about the implications of AI for nations together. And as we've mentioned quite a bit today, the OECD is really trying to do that as well. And lastly, I would say that a lot of the international organizations are also working together. And so we are partnering on this effort to build up the certification with the World Economic Forum. And so they are also, OECD is part of that Global AI Action Alliance is what that initiative is called. And it's to prototype a lot of these different principles and different types of practices that we're talking about. So there's a really good partnership, I think, that's happening with nations that are interested in coming to the table and willing to think about those efforts and learn from one another.
So thank you very much, Ashley. And the time's up for today, but I hope you're having a great day ahead. And thank you for joining us this early morning.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Bye.